Ethan Harris stood at the arrivals gate of Chicago's O'Hare Airport, scanning the crowd of passengers with a keen eye. He was here to meet Liam, his younger brother, who'd flown in from Los Angeles after years of estrangement. As the steady stream of travelers trickled out, Ethan's gaze sharpened on a familiar figure. Liam walked briskly toward him, suitcase in hand, looking slightly tense but determined. Ethan offered a quick, firm handshake before pulling his brother into a brief, perfunctory hug. "Let's get moving," he said, nodding toward the exit. There was no need for pleasantries. They had too much to address and too little time to waste. The drive back to Ethan's house was marked by silence. Liam sat in the passenger seat, his body language guarded. Ethan focused on the road, his jaw set, glancing at his brother occasionally, but saying nothing. Both men had unspoken hopes of bridging the chasm between them, but neither was inclined to sugarcoat the reality of their situation. Once they reached the house and Liam had settled into the spare bedroom, Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. His voice was direct. "All right, tell me what happened with Mom in L.A." Liam hesitated for a moment, then began. "It was fine at first. She seemed normal, until she got a call from some woman named Maya." Ethan's brow furrowed. The name tugged at his memory. "Maya? You mean Maya, Julian's wife?" Liam shrugged, clearly struggling to recall. "I don't know. I don't even remember her." Ethan gave a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Julian, Mom's boyfriend back in the day. We used to go to his house sometimes, remember? Maya was his wife. They had an open marriage. While Maya looked after us, Mom and Julian were busy." Liam frowned, trying to summon old memories. "I remember Julian, sure. But Maya? Not really." "Well, she was there," Ethan said curtly. "And as far as I know, she knew exactly what was going on." He paused. "So what did Maya say?" Liam's tone grew quieter. "After the call, Mom completely lost it. She tried calling Dad, then you. But when she couldn't get through, she locked herself in the bedroom and cried all night. The weird thing is, she acted like Dad didn't know about Julian. But I remember her saying years ago that Dad was aware of it." Ethan's expression hardened. "Of course she said that. Mom's always been good at spinning stories to suit her narrative. She thought she could keep everything under control. Looks like she was wrong." Liam shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but didn't disagree. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Liam spoke, his voice firm but tinged with accusation. "Why did you lie to me, Ethan?" Ethan straightened, his eyes narrowing. "You want to talk about lies? Let's start with Mom first. She's been manipulating us for years, Liam, making sure we didn't question her or dig too deep. And yeah, I made mistakes, but I didn't lie to you to hurt you. I was trying to protect you from the mess she created." Liam's gaze didn't waver. "You still should have told me." "You're right," Ethan admitted, his tone clipped. "I should have, but I didn't. And now here we are. The real question is, what are we going to do about it?" The room grew heavy with unspoken tension. Both men knew this wasn't just about their mother or the lies they'd been fed. This was the crossroads where they would decide whether they remained brothers or stayed distant strangers. Ethan didn't flinch as he met Liam's gaze. "Look, I'm not here to make excuses or sugarcoat what happened. But if we're going to fix this, we need to stop pretending we don't know who's really at fault here. It starts with facing the truth about her, about Julian, about all of it." Liam nodded slowly. "All right, let's figure it out." Ethan watched Liam carefully as he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful but guarded. The weight of their father's email still hung in the air, and Ethan decided it was time to address the real issue head-on. "I didn't lie to you, Liam," Ethan said firmly, his voice calm but unyielding. "I repeated what Mom told me because I thought it was the truth. She spun the story so well that I didn't question it. But now we know better, don't we?" Liam frowned, but didn't interrupt, letting Ethan continue. "She lied to me, just like she lied to you. And what burns me the most is that she wasn't just lying. She was manipulating us, playing us against each other, against Dad. She knew exactly what she was doing." Liam folded his arms, his expression hardening. "And Dad just went along with it? How could he sit back and let all this happen?" Ethan's jaw tightened, because he didn't know the half of it. "You saw the email. He found out recently, not back then. If he had known, do you honestly think he would have let Julian live under his roof or allowed Mom to parade that relationship in front of us? She kept it from him because she knew he wouldn't stand for it. Liam opened his laptop again, glancing at the email that had upended their family's carefully constructed lies. He read aloud, his voice sharp with disbelief. She confessed that her lover lived with you the whole time I was away. She even took you both to see him after I returned. He slammed the laptop shut. It's disgusting. She's disgusting. And she didn't even regret it. Ethan nodded curtly. Exactly. She didn't care about what she did or who she hurt. All she cared about was herself and her precious Julian. Liam stared at the closed laptop, his hands clenched into fists. I don't understand how someone could do that. To us. To Dad. To her own family. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unrelenting. Because she doesn't think like we do, Liam. She thinks of herself first. Always has. And if you're expecting an apology or some sudden realization from her, don't bother. She's not sorry. She never will be. Liam exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. So what now? What do we do with all this? Ethan's voice was steady as he replied. We move forward. We deal with Dad, make things right with him. And as for her, she's out. She made her choices. Now we make ours. Liam nodded, a flicker of determination in his expression. All right, let's make things right with Dad. He doesn't deserve this mess. Ethan stood, his movements deliberate. No, he doesn't. And he'll know we're on his side, that we're done playing Mom's games. For the first time in years, there was a sense of unity between the brothers, a shared resolve to set things straight, to rebuild the bonds that their mother's deceit had nearly destroyed. Ethan glanced at Liam as they walked toward the living room. We start tomorrow. Together. Together, Liam echoed, his voice firm. Liam sat back in his chair, staring at the closed laptop with a mix of anger and determination. Ethan, we need to fix this. Dad can't go on thinking we pulled away because we were keeping secrets from Mom. He deserves to know the truth. He needs to hear it from us. Ethan nodded, his expression unwavering. I agree. But we're not just telling him what happened. We're going to do something about it. He spent years thinking Mom's betrayal was his fault, that he wasn't enough. That stops now. Liam frowned, tilting his head. What do you mean? Ethan's gaze hardened. Julian. He's the one who tore Dad's confidence apart, even from the grave. Mom might have been the architect, but Julian played his part too. Dad called it being stripped of his manhood. If we're going to make things right, we're taking that back. Liam narrowed his eyes. Julian's dead. How exactly do you plan to destroy someone who's not even alive anymore? Ethan smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. His ghost. His memory. We erased the whole Julian has over Dad by tearing down every false pedestal Mom put him on. She painted him as this perfect, irreplaceable figure, someone she chose over Dad. We're going to crush that illusion. Liam leaned forward, his hands clasped together. All right, I'm in. But what about Mom? Are you really considering forgiving her after everything she's done? Ethan let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Fuck you here. No. Forgiveness isn't something she's earned. But whether we hate her or ignore her, she's not worth letting into our heads anymore. She lied to us, manipulated us, and tore this family apart. That doesn't mean we have to let her keep doing it. Liam's expression softened, though the edge in his voice remained. She deserves to be alone after what she did to Dad, after what she did to us. Ethan nodded slowly. She made her choices, and now she'll live with the consequences. Our focus is Dad. He's the one who stayed, the one who raised us, even when everything fell apart around him. That's where our loyalty lies. Liam sat back, exhaling deeply as he processed his brother's words. You're right. She's done. Dad's the only one who matters now. Ethan pushed off the counter and walked toward the living room, his posture strong and assured. Then let's figure out how we're going to do this. We don't just owe Dad the truth. We owe him a chance to rebuild what Mom took from him. Liam followed, his steps purposeful. Together, Ethan glanced over his shoulder, a faint smirk on his lips. Together. For the first time in years, the Harris brothers felt like a team, united in their resolve to stand by their father and finally put an end to the shadow Julian and their mother had cast over their lives. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, justice, and showing their father that he hadn't been left behind. Ethan and Liam sat side by side at the airport, the faint hum of the terminal filling the silence between them. The plan was simple: face their father with the truth and stand by him, no matter what. But as the plane ascended into the sky, their thoughts shifted toward what awaited them: how they could dismantle the legacy of Julian and restore their father's confidence. Meanwhile, Rob sat in a dimly lit parlor in Montreal, surrounded by people who, by their own admission, had tacitly supported Julian's betrayal. His posture was rigid as he leaned against the mantel, staring down the family of the man who had shattered his life. The brass urn on the fireplace held Julian's ashes, a grim reminder of the man who had haunted him for decades. "I'll be direct," Rob began, his voice low, but carrying an edge that silenced the room. "I recently discovered that the woman I loved, my wife, had an affair with Julian Dumont for over 20 years. Not only did I not know about it, but I now understand that many of you did." A hushed tension filled the room as Rob's piercing gaze moved from face to face. Some looked away, guilt flickering in their eyes. Others met his stare with unease or quiet defiance. Finally, an elderly man, one of Julian's cousins, spoke up. "Monsieur Harris, please understand, to us of French descent, a woman taking a lover is—" Rob cut him off, his voice sharp. "Spare me the cultural excuses. I'm not interested in hearing how this was normal. It wasn't. Not for me, not for my family, and certainly not for my sons." The man's mouth snapped shut, and Rob continued, his voice unwavering. "Julian's affair with my wife wasn't just a betrayal. It was a desecration of my home, my trust, and everything I thought I stood for. And you all stood by and watched it happen." Avril shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but remained silent. Rob turned his attention to her, his tone growing colder. "You were her friend. For 20 years, you knew what was happening. Did it ever occur to you to say something? To stop it?" Avril's voice wavered as she replied, I didn't think it was my place." "Not your place," Rob repeated, incredulous. "You were complicit. Every time you stayed silent, every time you turned a blind eye, you helped her destroy my family." The room fell silent again, the weight of Rob's words settling over the gathered relatives like a heavy fog. His gaze shifted back to the urn on the mantel. "For years, Julian lived rent-free in my home, in my mind, and he's still here, even after his death," Rob said, his voice laced with disdain. "But not anymore." He stepped closer to the fireplace, his eyes locked on the urn. "This ends now." Avril stood abruptly, her face pale. "What are you doing?" Rob didn't answer. With deliberate precision, he reached for the urn, lifting it from its place of honor on the mantel. The room erupted in shocked whispers and a few protests, but Rob silenced them with a single glare. "Julian's ashes don't belong here," Rob said firmly. "Not in a place of reverence. Not in a home where his betrayal was nurtured." Avril's voice trembled. "That's my husband's." "Your husband," Rob snapped, his voice cutting through her protest, "was a man who thrived on dishonor and deceit. His legacy ends today." Without another word, Rob turned on his heel and strode out of the parlor, the urn clutched tightly in his hands. The gathered relatives stared after him, stunned into silence. Outside, Rob paused on the porch, his chest heaving as the cold Montreal air filled his lungs. He stared at the urn, his grip tightening. For years, this man had haunted him, had stolen his dignity, had driven a wedge between him and his sons. And now, finally, he would take control. Rob set the urn down on the porch railing and looked out into the distance. "You don't owe me any more," he said quietly, his voice resolute. "You never did." With a single motion, he tipped the urn over, letting Julian's ashes scatter into the wind. The cold breeze carried them away, erasing the last physical remnants of the man who had tormented him. As the ashes disappeared into the horizon, Rob felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't closure. But it was a start. The silence in the room was suffocating, as if Rob's searing accusations had sucked all the air from the space. For a brief moment, no one dared to speak, their stunned expressions betraying the weight of his words. Then an older man, clearly indignant, broke the stillness. "Monsieur Harris, while it is regrettable that your wife left you uninformed of her decisions, we fail to see what this has to do with us." Rob's knuckles tightened against the mantel, his self-control hanging by a thread. "In what culture," he began, his voice rising, "is it acceptable for anyone to stand by and watch a woman destroy her husband? That's what my wife did, and all of you, every single one of you, enabled it." His words landed like a slap, but most faces remained impassive. Aval, however, avoided his gaze, guilt etched on her features. Rob's eyes narrowed on her. He remembered her reaction when she had first let slip the truth about Karen and Julian. She had seen his devastation and said nothing. Now was the time to return the pain. "My only regret," Rob said, his tone icy, "is that Julian Dumont isn't alive. I would have told him to his face what a lowlife, contemptible excuse for a man he was." The room erupted. Voices rose in protest, some in outrage, others in disbelief. Rob stood still, letting the noise wash over him. He didn't care what they thought or felt. They had condoned Julian's betrayal for decades, and their opinions meant nothing to him. When the noise subsided, the same elderly relative who had spoken earlier cleared his throat. "Monsieur Dumont was a great man," he said firmly. "A respected artist, a restorer of cultural treasures. We honor his memory." Rob's lip curled in disdain. He straightened to his full height, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This is what I think of your great Julian Dumont." Without breaking eye contact, he turned toward the mantel and grabbed the urn containing Julian's ashes. The room fell into shocked silence as Rob unscrewed the lid with one hand, setting it aside with deliberate calm. His movements were precise, calculated, and then he unzipped his fly. The stunned gasps of the gathered family did nothing to stop him. Rob relieved himself into the urn, his expression one of grim satisfaction. The act was crude, but to him, it was justice. Aval was the first to recover from her shock. With a cry of outrage, she lunged toward him, her small hands grabbing for the urn. Rob held firm, refusing to let go. In their struggle, his aim faltered, and the stream hit Aval's torso. She recoiled in horror, stumbling back with a gasp of disgust. Tears sprang to her eyes as she clutched at her soiled clothes, her whimpers a symphony to Rob's ears. Still holding the urn, Rob turned on his heel and strode toward the hallway. He didn't need to see the reactions behind him to know he had left a scar on their perfect little facade. Reaching the bathroom, he locked the door just as angry fists began pounding on it. Ignoring the shouting, Rob moved quickly. He emptied a portion of the ashes into the toilet, flushing them away with satisfaction. Bracing one arm against the door to keep it shut, he rinsed the urn, carefully scrubbing the remaining ashes from its interior. The banging on the door grew louder, the voices more frantic, but Rob remained composed. With one final flush, the last remnants of Julian Dumont swirled into oblivion. By the time he emerged, the men who had been pounding on the door were too shocked to block his path. He walked back into the parlor, surveying the room. Aval sat sobbing in a chair, her shoulders shaking. The others glared at him with a mix of disbelief and anger. Rob's voice was cold and steady as he delivered his final blow. "Julian Dumont is exactly where he belongs, with the other filth. And don't think for a second that I feel any remorse. You all stood by and allowed this betrayal to happen. So as far as I'm concerned, you're just as responsible." He paused, his gaze lingering on a portrait of Julian hanging on the wall. Slowly, deliberately, Rob spat on it. "That," he said, his voice filled with contempt, "is my opinion of your so-called great man." Without waiting for a response, Rob turned and walked out. He didn't look back as he climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The road to the border stretched ahead, and with every mile he drove, he felt the weight of Julian's shadow fading. Rob had no idea if what he had done could get him arrested, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, he felt like he had reclaimed a piece of himself. Oscar's chest heaved as he released the stunned reporter, who stumbled back onto the couch, wide-eyed and speechless. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations and palpable anger. "Did she also tell you," Oscar continued, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "that she made us swear never to tell Dad about any of it? That she lied and said he already knew, just so we'd keep quiet? Did she mention how that lie tore us apart, made me lose respect for him, and pushed me to leave home? Did she?" John's gaze flicked nervously between Oscar and Karen, his discomfort evident. Finally, he shook his head. "No, she didn't." Kevin stepped forward, his expression cold and resolute. "Because she doesn't want anyone to know how much damage she's done. Not just to Dad, but to us too. She's been spinning lies for so long she actually believes them." John looked back at Karen, his expression now one of open disgust. Karen, who had been sitting stiffly with a veneer of composure, visibly faltered under his gaze. The disapproval from a neutral party, someone outside her family, struck deeper than she had expected. For a moment, Karen's mind scrambled for a defense, but then something broke within her. She had spent years justifying her actions to herself, telling herself that her love for Julian made everything acceptable. But now, faced with the unflinching condemnation of her sons and John, her carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Guilt flooded her thoughts, overwhelming her. But then, as if by reflex, Karen clung to the one thing that still brought her solace: her memories of Julian. Her lips curled into a faint smile, an unconscious retreat into a place where she felt loved and justified. The reaction was immediate. Oscar's eyes blazed with fury, and Kevin's jaw tightened. Even John recoiled, interpreting the smile as pride, a defiant declaration of her lack of remorse. Oscar took a step closer, his voice a low growl. "You think this is funny? You think your little affair is something to smile about?" Karen's smile faltered, but she quickly composed herself, glancing toward the painting on the mantel as if drawing strength from it. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I love Julian. I always have. And now that your father knows, I can finally stop hiding it. I can honor our love." Oscar stared at her in disbelief, his fists clenching. Kevin's voice cut through the tension, sharp and cold. "Honor it? By humiliating Dad even more? By putting this disgusting painting on display for the whole world to see? Do you even care what that does to him?" Karen bristled at Kevin's tone, but before she could respond, John interjected, his voice hesitant but pointed. "Mrs. Harris, didn't you tell me earlier that your husband abandoned the family? That he left you and the boys for years?" Oscar's head snapped toward the reporter, his rage rekindling. "Abandoned us? My father didn't abandon anyone. He was serving in the Navy during the Gulf War. He was protecting this country while he jabbed a finger toward Karen, was sneaking around with that French piece of trash." John's expression darkened as he processed the new information. "She told me he left voluntarily, that he wasn't there for you." Oscar's laugh was bitter, almost manic. "Of course she did. She's been rewriting history for years, telling anyone who'll listen that she was the victim. But let me tell you something. My father never once abandoned us. Not in his actions and definitely not in his heart." Karen's face went pale, her facade cracking under the weight of her son's fury. Kevin stepped closer, his voice measured but laced with anger. "Did you also tell him, Mom, about the lies you fed us? About how you made us believe Dad knew about Julian and didn't care? That you were the reason we pulled away from him?" The room fell silent, the accusation hanging heavily in the air. Karen's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Her defenses were crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. John rose slowly, his notebook clutched in his hand. "Mrs. Harris," he said, his tone now cold and professional, "it seems there's more to this story than I was led to believe." Karen's shoulders slumped, the weight of her son's anger and John's judgment finally breaking through her resolve. But instead of apologizing, she turned back to the painting, her gaze lingering on Julian's likeness. Oscar's voice cut through her reverie. "If you're going to stand there and wallow in your so-called love for Julian, then let me make this clear. That painting, that relationship, None of it erases what you've done to this family. You destroyed Dad. You drove a wedge between us. And now you're trying to rewrite history to make yourself the victim. Karen turned to face her sons, tears brimming in her eyes. I did what I thought was best. Save it, Kevin snapped, his voice like ice. We're done listening to excuses. You made your choices, and now you get to live with them. Alone. Karen's tears spilled over, but neither of her sons moved to comfort her. The damage was done, and no amount of words could repair it. Oscar's hands trembled at his sides as he glared down at Karen. The room felt electrified, charged with emotions too volatile to contain. Kevin, sensing where his brother's anger was heading, called out sharply, Oscar, Plan B. Remember Plan B. But Oscar wasn't listening. His gaze bore into Karen, and when he spoke, his voice was low and trembling with fury. Why don't you tell him, Mother? He said, gesturing toward John, who was frozen in his seat. Tell him the truth about Julian. Tell him that he never loved you, that he used you to get to us. Tell him what really happened when he lived with us. Karen's face twisted in confusion and denial. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice unsteady. Oscar stepped closer, his voice rising. You invited a predator into our home. While Dad was away serving his country, protecting this family, you let Julian into our lives, into our house, into your bed. And after he was done with you, he came for us. The words hung in the air like a bomb, each syllable shattering any pretense of control in the room. Karen recoiled as if struck. That's not true, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It is true, Oscar roared, his composure shattering completely. You knew what he was, and you let it happen. You didn't protect us. You let him hurt us, and you did nothing. The rawness of Oscar's accusation stunned everyone into silence. Karen's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. Her mind raced, desperately trying to reconcile the beautiful, romanticized image she had of Julian with the monster Oscar was describing. Kevin stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on his brother's shoulder. Oscar, enough, he said, his voice firm but quiet. She's not worth it. John, the reporter, looked like he was about to faint. The shocking revelation had him torn between his journalistic instincts and the very real, human discomfort of witnessing such a devastating confrontation. Mrs. Harris, he managed to stammer. Did you know any of this? Karen's lips trembled, her eyes darting wildly around the room as if searching for an escape. No, she said finally, her voice shaking. No, that's not true. Julian loved me. He loved me, and he would never. Stop lying, Oscar barked, cutting her off. You spent 20 years lying to Dad, to us, to yourself. Are you really going to keep defending him? Even now? Karen slumped back into her chair, her body shaking. Her defenses were crumbling, her carefully curated narrative unraveling before her eyes. She looked up at Kevin, searching for some sign of forgiveness, but his expression was stony. John, sensing the interview had spiraled far beyond his control, hastily grabbed his notebook and stood. I think I've got enough for now, he muttered, his voice tight with unease. I'll be in touch. He hurried out of the room, leaving the family alone in their storm of emotions. Kevin and Oscar exchanged a look, silently agreeing to stay united no matter what came next. Karen's voice broke the silence, weak and pleading. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know he would. Her words faltered, her guilt choking her. You didn't want to know, Kevin said coldly. You were so caught up in your fantasy, so desperate to keep living in this lie, that you ignored everything else. And now, because of you, we're left to pick up the pieces. Tears streamed down Karen's face, but neither son moved to comfort her. They had spent too many years hurting, too many years questioning their father and doubting themselves, to feel sympathy now. We'll tell Dad everything, Kevin said after a long silence. He deserves to know the whole truth, not the lies you've been feeding him. Karen shook her head frantically, her tears falling faster. Please no, she begged. Don't. He'll never forgive me. Good, Oscar said, his voice like steel. You don't deserve his forgiveness. With that, the brothers turned and left the room, leaving Karen alone with her shattered illusions. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, a final punctuation mark on the confrontation. Karen sat motionless in the empty room, staring at the door her sons had just slammed shut. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, denial, and anger battling for control. Her carefully constructed world had not just cracked, it had crumbled entirely. The painting on the wall stared back at her, a mockery of the life she'd built around Julian's memory. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. It was Avel. Karen ignored it, unable to face anyone just yet. The call went to voicemail, but it buzzed again almost immediately. Finally, she picked it up with shaking hands. "What?" she snapped, her voice trembling. "Karen." Avel's voice came through, urgent and distressed. "I need to see you. It's important." Karen hesitated. She didn't want to see anyone, but there was something in Avel's tone that made her pause. "Fine," she said finally. "Come over." Meanwhile, Rob and his sons were driving back to the house. The car was silent, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy between them. Rob gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. He had spent years trying to make sense of his wife's betrayal, and now his sons were pulling back the curtain on truths he hadn't been prepared to face. "I don't like the way we left things with her," Rob said finally, breaking the silence. "She deserves worse," Oscar muttered from the back seat. "You saw her face. She's still making excuses for him." Kevin sighed. "She's not going to change, Dad. She built her entire life on a lie, and now it's falling apart. That's on her, not us." Rob tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles whitening. "Maybe, but she's still your mother." Oscar scoffed. "She stopped being a mother the moment she let Julian into our lives." Kevin turned to look at his father. "We're not saying this to hurt you, Dad, but you need to stop worrying about her. She made her choices. Now it's time for us to focus on moving forward." Rob nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "You're right, but it doesn't mean I don't feel responsible." Kevin placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You're not responsible for her mistakes. She chose this path, not you." By the time they arrived back at the house, the sun was beginning to set. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. Rob hesitated at the threshold of the living room, his eyes falling on the broken fragments of the painting Karen had destroyed earlier. "She's gone," Kevin said after a quick search of the house. "Her car's not here either." Oscar frowned. "Good. Let her stay gone." Rob shook his head. "No, we need to find her." Before either son could protest, Rob's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was the police. His face darkened as he listened to the officer on the other end. When he hung up, he turned to his sons, his expression grim. "She's been arrested," he said. "Apparently, she caused a scene at an art gallery, destroyed a bunch of paintings Julian restored." Oscar let out a sharp laugh. "Guess she's finally lost it." Kevin shot him a warning glance. "This isn't funny, Oscar. She needs help." Rob nodded. "I'm going to the station. You two stay here." "No way," Oscar said firmly. "We're coming with you." Rob didn't argue. The three of them piled back into the car, the weight of their fractured family pressing down on them as they headed to the police station. At the station, they learned that Karen had been sedated and transferred to a nearby mental hospital. Rob felt a pang of guilt despite everything, but his sons remained resolute. "She brought this on herself," Kevin said as they walked back to the car. "We tried to give her a chance to make things right, and she threw it in our faces." Rob didn't respond. He stared out the window as they drove, his mind replaying the past few days over and over. When they got home, he finally broke the silence. "I need to figure out what to do next," he said quietly. "For all of us." Kevin and Oscar exchanged a glance, but said nothing. They knew their father had a long road ahead, and so did they. But for the first time in years, they felt like a family again, united in their shared pain and determination to rebuild what their mother had torn apart. Karen's descent into despair became a public spectacle. The media latched onto every sordid detail of her story, spinning headlines that painted her as either a tragic figure consumed by guilt or a villainess who brought ruin to her family. The vandalism of Julian's paintings only added fuel to the fire, cementing her as a pariah in the art world. Meanwhile, Rob, Kevin, and Oscar withdrew from the chaos, focusing instead on rebuilding their lives. Their time together, marked by bourbon-fueled fishing trips and honest conversations, became the foundation of a new beginning. They chose not to speak of Karen's actions publicly, shielding themselves from further fallout. "I don't think I'll ever trust another woman," Rob admitted one evening as they sat around a campfire. "You will," Kevin said, handing him a flask, "when the right one comes along." Rob chuckled but didn't argue. 2 years later, the right one did come along. Bella was warm, kind, and entirely different from Karen. Her authenticity was a balm to Rob's wounded heart, and her genuine interest in his relationship with his sons only strengthened their bond. She became a second mother to Kevin and Oscar, a role she stepped into naturally. Kevin and Oscar's lives also found stability. Kevin married Melissa, a fiercely loyal woman who made it clear she would tolerate no deception in their family. Oscar remained single but thrived professionally, channeling his anger into his work and emerging stronger for it. Karen's life, in contrast, spiraled further. Shunned by friends and family alike, she lived in isolation, her once vibrant world reduced to the confines of her small, lonely home. Her attempts to reconnect with her sons were met with cold rejection, especially from Oscar, whose fury had not abated. Kevin, despite his resentment, made an effort to visit her a few times. But the strain of their interactions, coupled with Karen's lingering inability to fully confront her mistakes, made the visits increasingly rare. The final time he saw her, she begged him to bring her granddaughter alone, without Melissa. "No," Kevin said firmly. "I won't hide anything from my wife or my child. You don't get to rewrite the rules now." Karen's tears didn't sway him. Her choices had alienated her from her family, and she was left to bear the weight of those decisions alone. When Karen passed away at the age of 58, her death was as lonely as her life had become. Kevin attended the funeral, scattering her ashes in the backyard of the home she had rarely left in her final years. Rob came to support his son, but he did not linger. Later that night, as Kevin stood over the small plot where he had scattered her remains, he caught sight of a neighborhood cat digging in the soil. A faint smile crossed his lips as he noted the animal's name, Philippe. "How fitting," Kevin muttered to himself, walking back to the house. Years passed, and the McDonald men built lives filled with love, laughter, and healing. Their annual fishing trips became sacred traditions, a reminder of the bond that had carried them through the darkest times. Rob and Bella's marriage flourished, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. Kevin and Melissa raised their children in a home free from secrets, ensuring the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Oscar, ever the maverick, found his own sense of peace, dedicating his life to causes he cared about deeply. The memory of Karen faded with time, while the stain of Julian Dumont's legacy was erased entirely. His name disappeared from textbooks, his paintings vanished from galleries, and his family distanced themselves from the scandal. In the end, the man who had caused so much pain became nothing more than a footnote in history. As for Rob, Kevin, and Oscar, they chose to live in the present, their shared commitment to each other a constant reminder of the strength they had found in family. And while the scars of the past would never fully heal, they serve as a powerful reminder of what truly mattered: love, loyalty, and the courage to move forward.